This is the Capcom Fighter Power Stick. This version was released for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. On this episode of JRPG, we'll be looking at this arcade pad, its history, and investigate why it wasn't more popular. In 1993, Capcom released the Capcom Fighter Power Stick for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. Known as the Capcom Power Stick Fighter in Japan, it was rebranded to the Capcom Fighter Power Stick here in the US for both the Super Nintendo and the Genesis version. This arcade stick was released primarily with Street Fighter II - Special Champion Edition in mind. The aforementioned game is a reshelled version of Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting due to legality issues regarding using the title of a game on competing hardware. This game was the first fighting game to fully utilize the 6-button Genesis and Mega Drive control pad. According to Capcom promotions in the original arcade stick packaging from the US, this fighting pad was made to be the official accessory to recreate the Street Fighter arcade at home. This arcade pad is a mirrored version of the Capcom Fighter Power Stick for the SNES. Interestingly enough, though, the arcade sticks have a reverse color scheme than their corresponding system. According to Sega Retro, the shell of the Capcom Power Stick Fighter was recycled and painted white for the Capcom Power Stick Fighter MD and also the Capcom Fighter Power Stick in America. The Capcom Fighter Power Stick's features include 4 or 8-way joystick movement, 3 turbo settings, 3 slow motion settings, 6-button or 3-button play for all your Genesis games. The unique 6-button arcade layout is identical to that used on Street Fighter II arcade machines. This fight stick measures 13 3/4 inches by 8 inches, or 34 centimeters by 20 centimeters, and weighs less than 2 pounds or less than 9 kilograms. The joystick has micro switches which give off a more accurate arcade-like feel when compared to some of the other arcade pads at the time. What is also interesting is that there is a blank spot on the back of the control deck with an assorted serial number. There's no residue or anything, but the blank area is still there. Even the SNES version has the same blank space. Another interesting fact is that the Capcom Power Stick Fighter MD has a sticker on the back of it, at least in the Japanese version. I still haven't confirmed if it has it in the PAL region. However, that poses the question, why did we only get a little strip with a serial number on it when they had more of a actual label? Even though the label's not taking up all the space, it's still strange that it has such a small label, and why the label is only on the Japanese ones. For what makes this arcade stick tick, we're going to look at my friend Wipeout Guy 7's video.
I said before, it felt a lot like a Japanese arcade stick, and that's because this particular one here is actually a Sumitsu LS40 clone. So if you've ever seen a Sumitsu LS40 outside of an actual stick body, this is what you would expect to see. It even has the blue kind of housing here. There's a white gate connected to the different micro switches there on the bottom. And then of course you'll notice the main board over here is really large for what it does. It's just a few switches, and the connectors, you have an actual connector that goes to the different micro switches here on the joystick, which is a pretty cool design. So again, it's really easy to pull this off and then take it apart and mod it for something else if you want to. There's the connector that goes back to the actual Genesis cable or the Mega Drive cable. It actually says Capcom on the chip here on the board. And then, as I said before, the buttons felt really close to arcade buttons instead of like a rubber membrane joypad feel or joypad design. And they actually are arcade style buttons. Well, at least they're mechanical switches.
The Capcom Fighter Power Stick can be used to play other games as well, not just fighters. It can provide an arcade-like feel to shooters, Wipeout Guy 7 mentions that it's great for Musha, and it can act as a standard controller as well. I even played some Sonic the Hedgehog with it. The Capcom Power Stick Fighter can also be used on a Sharp X68000. This fight pad can also be used on an FM Towns, which means that the American version probably is just as able to play on these consoles. This fight pad also works on the Atari 400 and 2600. I don't know if it works on an 800 or a 5200 because I don't have them, but I would imagine that it does. If you own an Atari, you owe it to yourself to buy a Capcom Fighter Power Stick for your Atari alone. What's strange is I see more posts discovering this fight stick online than actually knowing the history of it. So it's pretty difficult to figure out why it wasn't more popular than its SNES counterpart. The game broke 1 million copies plus on the Genesis and Mega Drive. Maybe it was the price of the stick, or that you had to buy it separately. What was the standard for Street Fighter games in the 90s as well? The Genesis had Mortal Kombat, but if the SNES had Street Fighter, then that would make sense as to why the Genesis version wasn't more popular. A general consensus that I found across a couple message boards is that they prefer the SNES version to the Genesis version. Wikipedia also shows that the ratings were slightly higher for the Super Nintendo version over the Genesis and Mega Drive version, but not by much. The Super Nintendo version of the Capcom Fighter Power Stick could also be played on previous consoles. It had a hookup or a cord, something of that fashion, that allowed it to be played on not just one console, but two. One newer one and one older one. The Genesis and the Mega Drive one, on the other hand, did not have this ability. It may be able to hook up to a Master System, but I currently don't have a Master System, so I'm unable to test that. All in all, I think this arcade pad is a pretty cool find. My girlfriend picked this up for me at a garage sale, along with a bunch of other stuff. Super Nintendo, a Genesis, and I had never heard of it or knew too much about it, so I figured it would be a great topic to delve more into. This control pad is also pretty cheap due to the lack of collectors looking for it. However, I don't see it becoming too expensive in the near future. It's still a pretty nifty arcade controller though if you want to have that arcade feel without it hurting your wallet. It's a good and quality arcade pad, and since this is my only arcade pad currently, I'll definitely be out looking for more games that I can play and have that arcade-like feel. Especially Atari games. I hope you learned something this episode that you didn't know before about this unique arcade pad. I encourage you to check out Wipeout Guy 7's video at the end of this video, or some of my other videos if you want to learn more about gaming in general. Wipeout Guy 7's channel will also be in the description below. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you on the next video.
This is probably the best arcade stick you're going to find for the 16-bit era. In the United States at least, unless you want to build your own. It works excellent for arcade games, especially for shoot-em-ups, for beat-em-ups. You know, of course it was designed for fighting games, but it's definitely not restricted to that.